The long-range spice trade began in around 1000 BCE with the movement of cinnamon and pepper from India and Indonesia to Egypt. For the next 1000 years, the Arabs served as the sole middlemen of the spice trade, picking them up in Southeast Asia and delivering them to the Red Sea ports. Around 120 BCE, a shipwrecked Indian sailor washed up on the Red Sea coast of Egypt and taught the Egyptian Greeks how to ride the monsoon winds across the Arabian Sea to India. When the Romans took over Egypt in 30 BCE, about 120 ships were leaving Red Sea ports annually to load their holds with spices in India. Welcome to The Why in History. I am Ajay Kaul, and today we take a look at the global spice trade, its origins, its impact, and its evolution through the ages. By 1 AD, a full-blown trading network was operating across the seas of the Far East, with India at the center. Indian ships were sailing south through the Indian Ocean to Indonesia, and there they traded pepper for cloves and nutmeg. Chinese ships sailed the South China Sea and reached as far as the Spice Islands, Indonesia, and Sri Lanka. The Spice Islands are a small group of islands to the northeast of Indonesia, and they were known for the production of mace, nutmeg, and cloves around that time. So the spice trade had created a maritime trading route of about 9,000 miles that stretched all the way from Rome across the Mediterranean through the Indian Ocean to Indonesia and on to China. And India was at the center of this trade route. Now, the traders within the Arabian Peninsula were sailing directly to these spice-producing lands within India and Indonesia and selling their goods in Alexandria, Egypt, which at the time was the center of trade. And the Arabs were very artful in keeping the competition at bay by creating fantastic stories about the challenges of getting the spices. Stories like cinnamon growing in shallow lakes guarded by winged animals. And these stories actually helped them in selling the spices at a premium. After the Romans took over the city of Alexandria in 80 BCE, they initiated voyages from Egypt to India, and it was under their rule that Alexandria became the greatest commercial center of the world. And spices ended up being one of the primary commodities traded in Alexandria. And these found their way to the markets of Greece and the Roman Empire. So what was behind the lure of the spices? Was it purely for flavoring purposes, or did the spices have some other use as well? Well, food flavoring was the primary purpose, but then spices and herbs played an important role in ancient Greek medical science. Hippocrates, after whom the Hippocratical medical oath is named, wrote about spices and herbs, including saffron, cinnamon, thyme, coriander, mint, noting that great care had to be given for the preparation of herbs for medicinal use. Of the 400 herbal remedies utilized by Hippocrates, at least half are still in use. As far as flavoring was concerned, ancient Greeks used caraway and poppy seeds in bread, fennel for vinegar sauces, coriander as a condiment in food and wine, and mint for flavoring in meat sauces. The Romans were also extravagant users of spices and herbs, and particularly they had spice-flavored wines and spice-scented balms and oils for bathing. And since spices were supposed to have healing properties, these were also used by the Romans in healing plasters. After the collapse of Rome in 250 AD, the epicenter of world trade shifted first to the Byzantine Empire and then to Europe as it emerged from the Dark Ages. Through the early Middle Ages, the Republic of Venice within Europe began to build its military and soon became one of the strongest naval fleets in Europe. Venice went on to establish a trade deal with the Holy Roman Empire and secured control of the Adriatic Sea from pirates. Now, this was important for Venice because to gain access to the spice route, having a safe passage through the Adriatic Sea was very important. And when Byzantine Emperor Basil II decreed that merchants from Venice would not be subject to taxes imposed on other European merchants, Venice was able to establish a direct link with the spice trade of the Near East. So Venice inserted itself as a middleman in the trade route between the Middle East and Europe with respect to spices. So the spices from the east would land in Cairo, from where they were shipped to Alexandria. From Alexandria, they moved to Venice via the sea route. And from Venice and Genoa, the spices were shipped to London and via inland routes across the rest of Europe. And because of their monopoly over the distribution of spices, cities like Venice and Genoa became extremely rich, and the rest of the European powers became envious of their wealth, particularly Spain and Portugal. And then in 1453, Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, fell to the Ottoman Turks. And the Ottoman Turks cut off one of the inland spice routes connecting Europe to the Mediterranean. Though it did not impact the spice trade per se, but it did create a bottleneck in the free movement of spices, and that led to a further increase in prices of the spices. And that is when Spain and Portugal started seriously looking at an alternate route to India, the Spice Islands, essentially the East Indies. So in 1492, the Spanish expedition, led by Christopher Columbus, embarked on a route to the East Indies, but the strategy was to go west, crossing the Atlantic into the East Indies. The one thing, though, that Christopher Columbus did not realize was that there were two continents in the way, and he ended up in one of them, North America. The Portuguese, though, decided to go eastward around Africa to the East Indies. In 1498, Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama's fleet successfully rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached the Indian port of Calicut on the west coast of India. Then, as it is now, it was the most important port in the pepper trade. The Arabs were shocked to see the Portuguese on Indian soil, and right there, they saw their monopoly on spice trade crumble. Finally, the ocean route from Europe to India had been found. But they were not satisfied just with landing in India. Subsequent Portuguese expeditions continued beyond India and were able to find a sea route to the East Indies through the Malacca Strait between the Malay Peninsula and the island of Sumatra. Within a few years, the Portuguese dominated the European spice trade. And because they were going through a complete sea route, they were able to transfer spices in much bigger quantities than had been done before, to the extent that it is said that if you took a walk along the Lisbon harbor, you could easily smell the spice. And the beauty of this was that the Portuguese owned the entire sea route, so there were no middlemen, and the profits completely belonged to the Portuguese. Now, one point to note here is that the sea route around the continent of Africa was considered to be very unknown and treacherous. And that is primarily the reason why Christopher Columbus decided to go westward instead of around Africa. The Portuguese, though, had been making small incursions along that route. For example, in 1456, they had reached the Cape Verde Islands and colonized them. And then in 1482, they went further south to the Gulf of Guinea. But further south from the Gulf of Guinea is where matters got a little complicated because of the Benguela current, which tended to push the ships up north. To avoid these currents in the ocean, the Portuguese had devised a technique called the turn of the sea, which meant instead of traveling close to the shore, they tended to move away from the current as far as possible, and once they had crossed the span of the current, they would come back closer to the coast. So in the case of Africa, it meant steering a little bit towards South America, making a C and coming back towards Africa. Wait, did I say they steered closer to South America before turning back towards Africa? Yes, I did. And subsequently, in the year 1500, in one such expedition, a naval commander by the name of Pedro Alvarez Cabral steered a little too close to South America and ended up on the coast of Brazil. And that started the colonization of Brazil by the Portuguese. Later, Portuguese ships would stop in Brazil to get refueled on their way to India. So having mastered the Cape route, as it was called, the Portuguese spent the next 15 years consolidating their power along this route. And the man who made it all happen was a brilliant naval commander, Alfonso de Albuquerque. And using military force, Albuquerque was able to obtain a string of fortresses and outposts along the route throughout the region. And these included Socotra at the mouth of the Red Sea, Hormuz along the Persian Gulf, and Malacca in the Malacca Strait. But the most significant of all was the capture of Goa on the Indian subcontinent on November the 25th, 1510. And this made Portugal the first European nation to gain a foothold on the Indian subcontinent and lay the foundation for a 450-year-long reign in Goa. And just to give perspective, it would be another 16 years before the Mughals would set foot in India and establish the Mughal Empire. For the next 100 years, the Portuguese maintained absolute monopoly on the spice trade in Europe. And the most important factor facilitating this monopoly was the closely guarded secret with respect to the details of the Cape route. Many European powers indulged in espionage to get access to the secrets of the Cape route from the Portuguese, but failed miserably in doing so. Well, for every secret, there is a mole. And the mole in this story ended up being a man named Jan Hauken van Linschoten, the Dutch secretary of the Archbishop of Goa. And he spent 5 years in India from 1583 to 1588. And as the secretary of the Archbishop of Goa, he was able to gain access to the maps, navigational details, and other information related to the Cape route. Jan Linschoten meticulously copied all details related to the route, including currents, hazards, winds, and navigational landmarks that were key to a successful journey. He also captured information related to trading, meaning the trading conditions, who to buy from and who to sell to, and how to bypass Portuguese-controlled sea lanes. In 1592, Jan Linschoten returned to the Netherlands and started compiling all the details around the Cape route into a book. The book, titled Itinerario, was published in 1595, and it immediately piqued the interest of the Dutch administration. Within a year, a Dutch expedition left the Dutch shores, headed to the East Indies, with a copy of the Itinerario on board. It successfully navigated the Cape route and within a year returned with a big load of spices, making a handsome profit in the bargain. More Dutch expeditions followed, and as the word spread, the Itinerario got translated into English along with added inputs from the Dutch expeditions. And with the new and enhanced version in hand, an English fleet departed for the East Indies in the year 1600. But this English expedition was not just any other private expedition. It was owned by a private corporation, the Honourable East India Company, or EIC. The EIC had been granted a royal charter by Queen Elizabeth I, which gave it monopoly on all English trade in Asia. 2 years later, the Dutch copied the English example and created the Dutch East India Company. Together, the Dutch and the British East India Companies were able to give stiff competition to the Portuguese. And slowly, the Portuguese started losing out to the Dutch and the English. The reason? The Portuguese were backed by the Portuguese crown, whereas the Dutch and the British East India Companies were private enterprises fully backed by stock investments of the newly burgeoning merchant class. The return on investment, though, was massive. Vasco da Gama's expedition in 1498 had an ROI of 6,000%. With the Portuguese influence slowly waning, it was the English and the Dutch who went head-to-head in that region to dominate the spice trade. But the Dutch, who were better organized and had deeper pockets, were ultimately able to push the British East India Company out of Southeast Asia. And in doing so, they became a territorial power with full control over modern-day Indonesia, which at that time was named the Dutch East Indies. Pushed out of the East Indies, the British East India Company turned its attention to the other spice power, India. And the British East India Company too, like its Dutch counterpart, became a territorial power in that region and administered India for the next 100 years till the British Crown formally took over the governance of India in 1858. And it is on that note that we end this section of the program. On to the quiz section. Question from the previous episode. Which president signed into law the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, which granted amnesty to more than 3 million immigrants living illegally in the United States? The Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, or the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, was passed by the 99th United States Congress and signed into law by US President Ronald Reagan. So the answer is A, Ronald Reagan in 1986. Question for the current episode. What spice was the biggest revenue contributor in the European spice trade? Was it A, cinnamon, B, cloves, C, nutmeg, or D, pepper? Once again, what spice was the biggest revenue contributor in the European spice trade? Was it A, cinnamon, B, cloves, C, nutmeg, or D, pepper? The answer will be provided in the next episode. That's all we have in the current episode. We now take a break for the holidays, and the next episode will air on January the 6th, 2024. And in that episode, we'll take a deeper look at the hype around artificial intelligence, its history and growth, and the potential for the future. Till then, stay safe and keep looking for the why in history.